Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so excited to introduce our guest, Evan Transue, and he is going to be sharing his journey with us of navigating substances and substance abuse and also mental health issues and how those things overlapped in his journey through that. With that, let's get to Evan.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. These are always a privilege to get to have these types of conversations with these types of audiences. It's actually one of my favorite things to do. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about you. You have a history with the topic that we're going to be talking about today and about, drug use and mental health. And I think it would help our audience to just start with, can you tell us a little bit about your story and what's kind of led you to where you are today?
Yeah. Tell me how summarized you want it. Is this a 5-minute story, 10-minute, 2-minute?
Yeah. 5 minutes is great. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So it all started for me at around 5 years old. And I always want to specify this from the get-go. I actually grew up in a very nice household, good family. And the reason I say that is because when I'm starting to share what I'm about to share, there was no like obvious trauma, or certainly I still have never connected it to this day. Everything was going very well. But I started to exhibit some symptoms of both mental and physical health issues at that age. And one of the biggest ones was panic attacks. Now, we didn't know, my family and I did not know these were panic attacks at the time. But after they happened over several months, not every day to be clear, like maybe a few times per month tops, we went to the doctor. And there is very few things I remember from 5. This might actually be the only thing I remember from 5 years old, to be honest. I don't know about you guys listening, but you don't have many memories from then. And I'll never forget, though, we sat in the doctor's office that day, and my mom and dad were there. My dad, I think, took off work. And the doctor said to us, this is not something to get too worried about. Evan just gets himself a little worked up, and he's going to outgrow this. I also want to specify I would imagine 100% of the people that are listening to this have never heard my story or hear me talk. I am not condemning that doctor or against Western medicine anyway. That's not what I'm saying. It was just interesting looking back to see how certain probably societal stereotypes affected him in the same way that it would affect all of us, because this was a good person that meant well. And I sometimes wonder, is it because I came in with 2 parents that loved me and I'm only 5 that he thought this kid can't be dealing with panic attacks? So you might wonder, well, how do you even know you were dealing with panic attacks then? Because we went in again 10 years later for the exact same symptoms that were now happening daily. It was like controlling my life. And I got diagnosed with panic disorder at that time. And so my mom, I wasn't literally mad about this. My mom, of course, she's protective mama bear. She's all upset. She's like, we came in, 10 years ago for this same exact thing. And you guys promised this was something he was going to outgrow. So lo and behold, Western medicine is ran by people that are fallible, just like all of us, right? No news there. So
Yes.
they're doing the best that they can. We all are. And over that time period, though, from 5 to 10 or 5 to 15, I'm sorry, I started to develop this idea, very childish logic, but it was my logic nonetheless, that I'm not getting better. Doctor said I'm going to get better. Doctor is smart. Doctor is wealthy. This is a high status in society. Even as an adult, you still look at those people as status symbols to many degrees. So I started to think, if they can't figure it out, I must be the problem. So the worse my symptoms got, the more reserved I actually became in sharing what was happening. And the only reason we went back at 15 is because it was getting so bad that I was going to the hospital sometimes for the panic attacks, because I was so convinced in that moment that I was going to die. And 15 to 18 that was a whole different thing, because 5 to 15, I had the symptoms. I didn't like them. I wouldn't wish them on anyone, but I could still maintain my life to some degree. 15 to 18, I could no longer do that. And what ended up happening is other mental health issues started stacking on. Somewhere along the way, generalized anxiety disorder came in there. So I'm in this constant state of, shoulders always up. You got headaches, your heart's fast. You're just nervous all the time. And depression, right? And for those that don't know, I'm sure on your show, they'd probably be way more familiar with this, but just in case, depression is not always caused by this, but it's very common for it to come after, a long history of anxiety disorders, right? It's almost like you kind of think about it just naturally, you kind of do get depressed, literally, from that stuff happening. I don't think it's that simple, and that's why it happens. It's not like you're just depressed about the anxiety, but there is something to be said about your mental state when something keeps hitting you every single day, and it's really affecting your life, especially something like panic attacks. I would argue that depression was the thing that I allowed to change me as a person more than anxiety, more than anything else, because that's when I started, acting out. That's when I started using the drugs as a negative coping mechanism. And it wouldn't be until past 18 years old that I really started to take some proactive action to get this stuff under control. And it took a lot of loss in the meantime. I was in a 3-week period at the age of 18. I got kicked out of school that had a 99 point something graduation rate. It's not like, people were leaving there. So I got kicked out of there. I went to juvie, and I don't ever like to sound like more of a hardened criminal than I am. I went for like 4 days, to be clear. It was basically a long weekend. But I did go to juvie, unfortunately. I spent my 18th birthday on house arrest. So this is all happening within like a 3-4 week span. And I went back to the same coping mechanisms that I had developed over those years, which was drugs. But it wouldn't be for a few months later until I had what I call my aha moment, like a wake up call moment, that I really started to change things. But that's the summarized version of all this in about hopefully 5 minutes. What was 5 minutes?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I think people, I like what you said about like you grew up in a good household, you had supportive parents, because I think a lot of times parents are under the impression that if they do a good job, their kids, everything will turn out perfectly fine. Right. And this isn't always about, parenting is a portion of this, how we show it for our kids, what we do, certainly, right.
Mhm.
Or what we don't do. But our mental health is not always contingent on our parents' intervention, right? It's also about society. We have a lot of other pressures too going on.
I love that you said that, because you probably understand that in your profession better than almost anyone. I cannot tell you, Bryce, how many times I've given, because I usually give talks to kids, but if I give talks to parents, which is about 5% of the time, how many of them perceive the mental health issues that their child is experiencing to be some type of moral failing on their part? And then, what I always ask them, I said, if your kid were to be diagnosed with cancer or an autoimmune condition, would you consider that the same level of moral failing on your part? And of course, like, no, what are you talking about? And I said,
Mhm.
and I say it firmly, but kindly and lovingly. I'm like, my friend, you're allowing yourself to be affected by the same stigma that you grew up with that's still affecting kids nowadays, right? You have perceived something to be true that is not true. And like you said, are there things that we can do that are better than not? Sure. If a kid's growing up, eating organic food from their backyard of their family's house, yes, I'm in the holistic health space. I am positive that that person is probably less susceptible to certain cancers and autoimmune diseases. How much? I'm not a scientist. I can't measure that, but I would bet my money that they're better off. So it's not that we can't always learn and do better as parents or human beings. That would be to dismiss responsibility completely, and that's silly. But to act like it is some great failing, or you've done everything wrong because your kid has depression, that's a misunderstanding of how these conditions develop, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. Totally agree. So there's a great segue into, I wanted to talk about, what do you think is the mental health? We say crisis, and I interviewed a psychiatrist not that long ago, but he was talking about like, is it a crisis if this has been going on for this long, right? Like we have a very long standing problem with mental health issues. I do think it's exacerbated. I think it's gotten worse. Um, but what do you think is contributing to especially teen mental health, but also childhood mental health struggles?
That's tough, because far be it from me to correct a psychiatrist. For those that don't know, I'm a non-credentialed person. This is an experiencer that is a nerd and researches stuff. So I want to make sure that if I'm challenging that, I do so appropriately. But I would love to talk to that person and ask what constitutes a crisis, because to me, the second leading cause of death right now, in America at least, from age 10 to 35 is suicide. And the number one cause of suicide is untreated depression. So if our kids are dying, the second most common reason that they're dying is because of taking their own life. I don't know. I would constitute that as a crisis personally. That's
Mhm.
me. So what do I think is causing it though? Good question. I think there is so many factors here, even as someone who probably admittedly has a bias towards the functional medicine and natural medicine space. I can still acknowledge that there's increased diagnoses. I think that's real. I think we do actually just get better at diagnosing things over time. And I think there have been parents and upbringings that were terrible to their kids, and those cycles continue. And that kid never got properly labeled. And, there's a reason to avoid labels, right? That can create a stigma in and of itself. But sometimes it's nice to have a label just to have some clarity as to why you
Sure.
feel the way that you do and why you are the way that you are. So if I look at, I won't mention the family member's name, but there is a certain family member that I know that if you go back through like multiple generations, you can see the history of abuse and how each person then just developed their own flavor of it, swearing to God that they did better, right? And maybe they did in a sense, percentage wise, but they're still, engaging in their own form of abuse.
Mhm.
So how many mental health issues were going on for decades that we didn't know about? Now, with that said, I don't think that increased awareness is the only reason that we're seeing a mental health crisis. I think there's real things that we're doing. And I think one of the biggest things that I could contribute to a conversation, while also simultaneously admitting this is not the only reason for it, is I think there's a lot of physical health issues, physical problems that we have that are manifesting as mental health issues as well. And one of the reasons I can say that is because I'm someone who experienced that. I don't
Mhm.
mention this as like the core part of a show when I'm doing an interview about mental health, but what I never really get to talk about is at 18, I had 7 different diagnosed conditions. Only 3 of them were mental health conditions. I had 4 physical chronic health conditions at that time. And I'm not saying that the chronic health issues cause the mental health issues. I'm making the argument that the same things that are leading to the chronic disease epidemic and crisis, which that one, very easy to argue that that's an epidemic and crisis, I think they are also contributing to the mental health issues that we're seeing, but people aren't connecting that quite as well yet. And if I may, one of my favorite studies to reference is actually a meta-analysis. It shows that things like NSAIDs, so for those that don't know, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, this is like your Advils, okay? And this is not medical advice. I'm not saying take it for this reason because Advils have side effects long term, but it's to show you what's going on here. The meta-analysis basically showed that if you take these NSAIDs, they can temporarily relieve anxiety and depression in a statistically significant amount of people. Now you say, well, why on earth would an Advil or another NSAID temporarily relieve anxiety or depression symptoms in enough people that a meta-analysis can actually show? It was like on 100 studies or something that could actually show that there's validity to this. So you say, okay, because correlation is not causation. So you could say, well, a possible side effect of Advil is that it increases serotonin levels. I think that is very unlikely because the meta-analysis also looked at people who supplemented with omega-3 fatty acids and things like turmeric, specifically curcumin, which is kind of the main ingredient in turmeric. And all of these things have one thing in common. They are known, scientifically proven anti-inflammatory agents. And so then you wonder, okay, well, is it the inflammation that depending on your genetics leads to mental health manifestations for some people, possibly. And then you say, well, what's causing inflammation? And if we look at what we're doing in today's world, where we're disrupting sleep, in America, we have glyphosate. Every single person that is listening to this has measurable amounts of glyphosate Roundup in their body. That is awful, right? We're eating foods that we weren't supposed to eat. They're processed and packaged in a factory, thousands of miles away, sometimes in different countries, and shipped in here. It's amazing actually that we're doing as well as we are, in my opinion. I think those are some of the main things causing the mental health crisis that no one is really, I shouldn't say no one's talking about it. Not enough people are talking about it
Mhm.
in mainstream mental health conversations.
Yeah, no, this is great thought because I think we aren't talking about this as much. And I think, those foods that we eat are inflammatory a lot of times when they're processed foods. And we know that the body keeps score, right? So our body is tracking what we're doing all the time, whether it's something healthy or unhealthy. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, we have lots of packaged foods in our house. But we try to curb towards the more whole foods, right? But I think, this isn't shaming, this is just information, right? That when we know better, we
100%.
can do better. And I think being aware that our food can do something like impact our mood is so important to just think about. I think I was reading a book once and it was talking about not doing a diet or something like that. It was just talking about if you eat something. So, like, let's say you eat white rice
Mhm.
and then you evaluate after you eat that, how do you feel? Then you can make a decision for yourself. Is white rice something you want to eat? You eat asparagus. And then after that, you evaluate how do you feel? And I loved that way of being of like, let's really be our own detectives for ourselves. Does this type of food make me feel good? Does it make me feel hungry soon? Does it keep me feeling full? Does it help me to be my best self? Like, am I in a better mood? Right. Like, I
Mhm.
think those kind of things are great pieces, but we oftentimes are in such a fast process to go through life that we do turn to these more processed foods because they're easier. They're there, they're available, right? There's not a lot of work that goes into that. But I do that study that you referenced. I have seen that too, and I
Oh,
loved that
nice.
idea that that we could take, you know, an Advil or an ibuprofen and that we could feel better. And then it made me question too, like, what is that? That's the inflammation. I think we have so much inflammation in our bodies that we're not aware of. And when we have trauma, that stores in our body, and that's inflammation, right? It's bothering our whole entire body. So I think it's food, it's our experiences, it's all of it together. And mental health is physical health. So I appreciate
Mhm.
you crossing that barrier of like, it isn't just one problem looking at one thing, it's the whole view of the person, right? To like look at you as a kid and be like, okay, what is going on with this teen? He has all these things going on. Like, what could this be about? And instead of just looking at that one diagnosis or picking one thing out. So, why do you think that people that have mental health diagnoses often turn to substances or can become in a relationship that's unhealthy with substances?
Yeah, I have to say for those on audio, Bryce made me smile for like about 10 seconds straight, like a kid, because no one ever knows what I'm talking about with the Advil thing. So
Yeah.
God bless. Thank you. It's people need, it's so important if you've dealt with this stuff to understand what that could imply. So
Mhm.
anyway, I'll get to your question. Sorry. But the substance abuse thing, I think this is an answer that I don't know if people like hearing this answer, but I'm just a real person, so I don't know. I just give my answers. I think they turn to it because it works at first. At first, it's very rare that we choose to do something every day as humans. Forget the substances for a second. I mean anything. It's very rare that we do something that isn't enjoyable or isn't something that is bringing us some pleasure. The problem with substances, and I am a Christian, but I don't mean this in a religious way. I mean it metaphorically. Substances are the devil, right? They are literally the metaphorical devil because the devil gives you what you want, hypothetically up front, but the trade-off is you have to sell everything else, long term. And that's what drugs do. Drugs, not for everyone, I guess, but they do work in the beginning to some degree of distracting you. Or if you've been depressed for 3 years and all of a sudden you take a hit of something that is literally its primary job is to spike your dopamine or serotonin or whatever that particular drug might do, of course you're going to keep doing that for some period of time. But the issue is, again, this where it's the devil, it comes back and says, okay, now this isn't going to work as well and you're going to need more and more and more and more of this. And now what ends up happening, and what certainly happened to me, is I've only created a new set of problems. I got temporary relief that might have lasted all of 2 months. And for the remaining years that I abused drugs, which was way more than 2 months, I'm just managing a new problem and further repressing and suppressing the mental health issues that were already there. And the irony of all of it is, the devil leaves you eventually. So once you have to leave the drugs and you say, I need to get my life back on track, you realize not only did I never deal with the mental health issues, I found for most people, it certainly again was true for me, these things have been getting worse over time, not better. And it's like, well, no crap. You've been doing drugs for 3 years, right? Why was
Yeah.
it going to get better? So I think people turn to those things, bluntly because it works in the beginning. It's the only relief that they've ever felt. It's a distraction. It's something different from the prison that mental health issues can sometimes feel like you're living in. But it's man, it's not something to. I don't think I need to preach this, but it's not something to mess with. That was the biggest mistake I ever made. Uh, in the first 18 years of my life, I would say. And I made a lot of stupid decisions in 18 years, believe it or not. So I'm sure no teenagers have ever done that. But the biggest mistake I ever made was using substances to mask mental health issues, period.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think most people don't go into it thinking that that's what they're going to do, right? Like
Sure.
most people are like, don't do drugs. I'm not going to do drugs. And then what they find themselves is in a position where they don't know where to turn or how to help themselves feel better. And they don't have the resources to recognize that one, what they're dealing with is a real diagnosis, is a real thing that's happening in their body. It's a chemical response, right? And it may be a family history, right? Like you have family members who are anxious or depressed that can be genetically shared. And that, yes, the drugs do make you feel better, but you'll never get that same high again, right? You'll always be chasing it. I remember when I was in school, there was somebody who was a recovering addict, and they were talking about that they were always chasing that high, and that stuck with me of like, you want something, and it's almost like when you taste something for the first time and it's like so good, and then you try it again and it's like good, but it's like not as good as that first time, especially when it's something like a sweet, like a candy or whatever like that. You can't recreate that, and since I haven't done drugs before, I can't relate to that part personally in terms of drugs, but I can in terms of like food, where you like try it and then you're like, oh, I want that feeling again because that was so euphoric. It really helped me to feel better about my situation. Excuse me. And I bring this up because I think if you have a parent who has not tried drugs before, or a teen who's listening to this, I think, yes, that does feel better, but it doesn't actually solve anything, right? It's not the root of the problem that we're having. And so we have to get to the root of the problem in order to get actual tangible relief from that symptom.
Yep.
And so I think it's important to think about that. But as parents, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that we need to know about substances. One, you brought up about the fact that the substances will recreate those chemical responses in our body. And when we're seeking dopamine, that pleasure area of our brain, like we're going to want to go back to that. And it will be really hard to not do that. It's kind of like your phone, right? Like where it's like we get the dopamine hit when we pick up our phone, we have a notification, but this is so much more because it's like a chemical in our brains. And so it can be, did you have a process where you started with one drug and progressed to another drug? How did that work for you?
It's as stereotypical as you can imagine. The answer is yes. For me, it started with marijuana, and I guess that's not the rarest thing in the world nowadays. It seemed weird back then in the sense that, like, I felt like all my friends had at least tried alcohol first. I wanted nothing to do with alcohol for some reason, but the pot thing was, I don't know why. Maybe it's because my dad smoked cigarettes his whole life. There was just something about smoking that I was more okay with, interestingly, than the drinking side. And so I started with that. And it was an interesting experience because marijuana can provoke anxiety in a lot of people. And I am one of those people that it provokes, anxiety. And so again, there was always a little bit of irony in that it wasn't the most comfortable experience, but it did provide, again, enough of that relief or distraction. And certainly once the initial anxiety was over, I started to feel, just you're high, you're running around, you're just feeling goofy and you're not thinking about the troubles that you have. It took 6 months, maybe, before I tried the next thing. And the next thing for me was I had these genius plans at the time. Like I had heard a doctor at 15 when I got the panic disorder diagnosis recommend benzodiazepines temporarily, specifically Xanax. I don't know if this was for better or for worse, but my parents were against that and did not do that. I have to kind of argue that it probably was for better because I ended up getting that stuff illegally anyway. And I abused the hell out of that. That was the worst one. And so you do have teens that listen to this show?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you're, gosh forbid, if you're a teen out there that's hopefully listening for the right reasons, and like, I feel like, well, there's no wrong reason, but I feel like some of the teens that would be smart enough to listen to this show are like the ones that are doing everything right. I don't know. But if you ever had the temptation, or maybe you're in an active stage of recovery that's even more beautiful that you're listening, the things like Xanax, that shouldn't even provide a high to you. And I know that doesn't make sense right now if you're, 15 listening to this, but what I mean by that, there are no euphoric properties to that class of drugs. Well, to Xanax specifically. And I didn't understand what that meant. That means if you were to do something like, I've never done this, thank God, but if you were to do something like cocaine, that is a euphoria producing drug. It releases all these chemicals to make you feel, happy in a sense. I mean, too much is anxious and paranoid, but happy in a sense. There's probably a better word. Xanax doesn't have those properties. And so what was so interesting is how I reflected on it versus how my psychologist eventually explained this to me, that it doesn't have those properties. I'm like, so why did I feel so good? And he's like, because you've been walking around with so much stress and so much anxiety that comparatively, the feeling of not experiencing those feelings after year, who knows how long it had been going on. I mean, it's years at that point of daily symptoms. The relief is the high, quote unquote. So my point in even mentioning something like that, even if that only applies to 1 out of 100 people that'll ever listen to this, is I hope that changes your perspective on it, because I never realized that if I could just figure out a way to deal with the anxiety stuff and actually solve that, get to the root of it, like you were talking about, Bryce, well, then Xanax doesn't have, there is no high to it. Of course, you could be dependent on it or addicted to it if you continue to take it. Your body could develop a dependency. But I'm always very open about this. I ended up taking Xanax again, prescribed, later in my life for a fear of flying, which I no longer have, which is awesome. I never felt the need to go take that again. I never abused it. I never like started getting it off the street. It was so weird how I was able to take that at one point in my life all the time and abuse it, and there was no craving whatsoever. And then interestingly, if I were to make a decision, and I have done this very early in my life, I don't do this anymore, but if I were to make the decision to say, oh, we're traveling to California, or we're in a state where it's legal, who cares? Don't drive, don't do anything stupid, but like, let's grab a joint or something. That is the thing I crave the most. I can never touch that again. That is the thing, for whatever reason, that I would convince myself to do every day. And it's pot. It's just pot, right? As everyone says. But I found more people continue to justify the daily use of that than anything else. I do not think I'm like alone in that experience. So it was mainly those drugs, though. Alcohol came on third. And alcohol, I still never really drank in excess by itself. I hated alcohol. I just didn't like the feeling of it. But I did use alcohol, unfortunately, to potentiate the effects of the benzodiazepines, because I could only get so much at the time. So it was like I thought I had all the answers because I was like this smart kid making terrible decisions. So I'm like, I'm like a chemist with this stuff, saying, oh, if I put this in or do this, or I don't do this for that long, I can't get dependent. So I thought I had all the answers, but the 16-year-old logic is still not recognizing that, dude, you're doing drugs all the time, right? Like you don't have any answers at all right now. This is not a plan whatsoever. So yeah, that's how it happened for me.
Yeah. What do you think parents need to know about drug usage and teenagers? Like, what should we educate parents around and in terms of mental health? Like, what should they be aware of? When should they be concerned? What do you think the issues are?
There's going to be some parents that don't, that maybe don't like this advice and don't resonate with it. I would probably wait. If I was a parent, this is exactly what I would do, knowing what I know now. I would wait until I actually caught my kid doing something dumb. Because if you just go all paranoid and suspicious and helicopter parenting, that doesn't create a good relationship, right? Now, this is also coming from someone who has not been a parent yet, certainly to a teenager. So this is maybe bad advice, but I think the only answer after they get caught is if they're living in your household and you're paying their bills and you're suspecting that this hasn't changed, you need to do regular testing. And people are like, that's way too much. That's invasive. It's the only thing that would have stopped me would have been regular testing that I knew I had to go home and do at my parents' house. That is the only thing that would have stopped me from doing this. And I don't even know if that would have stopped it, to be dead honest. I probably would have tried to fake the test somehow, but that would have been the only shot we would have had, let's say, of me doing that, because people that are truly abusing drugs or truly addicted to it, they're going to find a way. Like, it's always crazy telling some of the more extreme stories of my journey, if you'll call it that, because people are like, oh my God, did you have two parents at home? Like, how are you doing this? I'm like, I had two great parents at home that were attentive. If you're abusing drugs, I'm thinking 2 steps ahead. So instead of hiding the drugs at home, we lived in the suburbs. We had cornfields near us. I knew the cornfields didn't get mowed down until October. I had a backpack full of drugs that was waterproof. I would throw it in the cornfield before I got home, so I have nothing on me, and I would wait and pick it up as soon as I left the house. So there is never anything on my person when I am near my parents, and there is no reality where they could possibly find where it's hidden. So the only way for them to have known that I was doing it is some type of urine test. Now, again, I wouldn't start with that because that's just a great way to probably create a terrible relationship with your kids. And this is still probably going to tick them off. But if you've had evidence, like you found pot in the bedroom, right? Like, it's there, or you found pills, even worse, right? In the bedroom, and it's there. That's not a theory anymore. I caught you doing drugs. I know you're doing drugs. That's why this consequence is happening. And I think we'd save some more lives like that. It's my opinion. I think the only other thing is too, the more or less aggressive approach, we'll call it, is we have to make sure that there's active work being done into figuring out why this person, this kid, has now concluded that drug use is better than their own reality. Because this is the only line I can get across to kids when I'm speaking in schools that seems to resonate and really hit differently. If I'm just there talking about drugs, Bryce, you know how it is. They've heard this a million times. They don't want to hear that. There's nothing new about it. I said, so I'm not here to tell you guys not to do drugs. I'm not stupid, right? And I'm really not advocating for it, but I'm just trying to build rapport with them. I'm like, I'm not here to not tell you to do drugs. I am here to ask this, though. How many people ever do you think have tried a drug, be it weed, alcohol, pills, whatever you guys are doing, and said, I can't wait to wake up and do this every single day? And for some reason, that line for the last 6-7 years of speaking has always you could see the facial expressions. It just hits differently, especially for the kids that are doing it, because they know that that's correct. And they know that's not the same message that they always get, where it's like, oh, don't do, you can never touch anything. Or like, I live in this adult world where I forget that kids do stupid stuff all the time. I just said, no, I know you're going to do stupid stuff, but let's remember that no one ever woke up and said, let's do this all the time. So if you're doing that, what's going on? And so to the message with the parents, I would say, I know it's hard. You can't make a teenager in a theory do anything they don't want to do. I guess you could force them, yes, to take a test if they're living under your house, but you can't force them to go to therapy or a doctor and participate in a way that you'd want them to participate. No one can force that, I guess. But we have to at least try. Like, we have to try to put them in the environments or situations where we can uncover what are the deeper things and feelings that are leading to the conclusion that it's usually subconscious conclusion, right? It's not a conscious one, that, oh, using drugs every single day or even frequently is a better reality than my reality without drugs. No one has ever said that out loud, because it's not actually what you want to do with your life. So if we could figure out those deeper things, then hopefully we can fix it. So I have my more harsh, firm advice, and maybe that's just my style of future parenting. And then my more like, hey, let's get to the bottom of this, loving, kind, passive advice.
Yeah. Well, and I think we can, excuse me, intermix both of those, though,
Sure.
in that we can be curious and also have some expectations, excuse me, for them to show up sober. And I think sometimes, I know it for me, as a parent, I certainly don't want the legal system involved with my life or my kids' life as much as possible, right? So it's like, maybe we're not waiting till that part, but it's also like, and talking to a recovering alcoholic, she was talking about, like, the perception of seeing this, and it gave her a feeling of feeling relaxed, right? It felt good. And so she wishes that her parents, when she came home intoxicated, would have said more, would have engaged themselves to say, like, hey, what's going on? Like, this is not the best way to handle this. Like, what's going on that's making you feel this way? So I love that idea of asking about their real reality, like how life is, that using drugs makes it better. What is the thing we're trying to avoid or get away from or cope with? And so that's a great place to be. How do we support our teens, right? And either knowing that they're probably going to try something, whether it's, marijuana, alcohol, pills, how do we support them?
I think one of the best things that my parents ever did, and you know what's even better, they lived up to it. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing when you get to experience it as a teen and realize they're telling the truth. They said, no matter how stupid what you do is, if you are in any danger or think you're in danger, you call us first, we deal with that first, and then we'll deal with the consequences later. And there is always going to be less consequences from you telling us first than there are if we find out on our own. So that doesn't mean it's not a free for all. It's not a frat party with my parents. They're not saying that you can do whatever you want. But the promise was, we'll always make sure that the immediate danger is taken care of for you. And we will always make sure that the consequences are less, but still present. That's for sure. They are less, though, than if we caught you doing it. And that's a pretty good deal. And so this is a funny story now. It was not so funny back then. But I tested this one time because it was probably like the 5th time I smoked pot. And guess what? I had a panic attack while smoking. So panic attacks already suck. Panic attacks your 5th time into smoking pot. That's like, I'm shocked I even tried to smoke again. That's really kind of weird trying to think about what the process was back then. But I was so scared. And we were at this movie theater, and like the sound's super loud in the movie theater, right? The screen's big. Like they're trying to create an experience at the movie theater for sober people. And so it was just too intense. I could not handle it. I thought I was dying. I thought something was happening to me. And I called my parents, and they were not mad. They picked me up from the movie theater, and they made sure I was not dying, right? And they realized very quickly this was a kid who smoked too much pot and was getting anxious. So I think we sat outside the hospital for like an hour just in case, right? Just so I can know we're there if anything needs to happen, but otherwise we're not going to get this all involved. And then sure enough, I calmed down. They took me home. Absolutely no yelling that night. And then the next day, I heard some things we won't share on the podcast, but they actually lived up to that. And that created such a high level of trust for certain future events, which did happen, which, I actually found myself in probably real dangerous situations. And I did call them, and same thing. There was consequences, and there's increasing consequences the more time you make the calls, I found out. Right? This isn't something you just make unlimited calls as it turns out. But they were always nice to me in the initial moment. I shouldn't say nice. That's probably a little generous, but firm, but not mean. They were never mean, never yelled, never raised their voice in that moment. It was always the next days afterwards once the safety was there. So I'm sure there's other ways. I think that's like maybe a bit unconventional. I know parents want their kids to do that, but I think maybe in practice, it doesn't happen, right? They do get mad. My parents said that was what's going to happen if I call them. They lived up to that. And every time they lived up to that, it built more trust, and it actually made me felt more guilty for putting him in these situations, which helped me with self-reflection. Now, it didn't work, first week, don't get me wrong, but that was one of the many aspects that eventually led me to actually taking some positive steps to getting help, because I did feel so bad that these people were willing to help me in my life, and I couldn't even help myself. So that's probably one of the best tips I could give. I'm sure there's a million other great ones. So
yeah, no, I like that knowing that they can call us, because I think we do say those things sometimes as parents, and then we're like mad that they did it, or whatever it is, tell the truth, and then you're like, you're in trouble, and then that negates that trust that you're trying to build, and you want your kids to be safe, right? Like ultimately we want them to live through this, whatever it is that is going on, and so we need to help contribute to that part. It doesn't mean, like you said, making a free for all, but I do like that advice of like letting your kids know that if they're in trouble, they've drank too much, they're, having a panic attack after smoking marijuana, that they can call you to get a safe ride home. Okay. So what do you want teens to know when we talk about drugs? Like, what do you think is the really important thing that you can impart to them?
Maybe I'm living in a fantasy world, but I wish we could somehow, get more leaders, and there are some out there already, but get more leaders that are willing to just say, I don't want to, just be honest and say, I don't want to do this. I've never wanted to do this. And I'm not going to do it as a result. And that sounds so simple on paper, but what I find happens is like, and I'm not advocating for drug use regardless of your personality style, but I am someone who tries to be objective. And I do think there are people in the world that are not mentally ill, that are naturally more curious. They're the people that love the roller coasters at 5 years old, or they do the somersaults or the spinny thing at the playground to the point that they're dizzy. They like experimenting with things. That is not in any way, shape, or form, again, just to be clear, saying go do drugs. But I think there is a difference. And now being almost 29 years old, I've seen these differences play out over 10 years. There is a difference in the life outcomes of the kids who were the roller coaster kids and just like, I'm going to try this one time, and then never did anything else, versus the kids who were hiding something, which was the majority of my friend group, right? Birds of a feather flock together. So the intention matters, but the group I'm really most concerned about is the group that was actually more like me. I was the biggest straight edge kid in the world at one point. I was like a teacher's pet kid when I was younger. And I allowed the pushes from the friend groups, even if it wasn't direct. No one told me, oh, Ev, you got to do this or you're not in the friend group. It was never anything like that. But just being around it, feeling the negative feelings, allowing for those circumstances to make me someone that I wasn't and never wanted to be. I guess the message to kids is just stand true in your principles and what you believe. If you don't believe that you should ever be doing drugs, then don't, man. And if the people that you're hanging around don't resonate with that, cool. Find someone who does. There's plenty of people, especially now, there's a really cool turn happening. There's people that are embracing this, and this is kind of scary, but there are also people who have done this stuff so young that they're already taking active recovery by the time that they're almost out of high school, which is astonishing. But she shares her story publicly. I'm friends with this woman, Kristen Haratunian. She was a speaker with me at a similar bureau for a while. She, first of all, just rock star person and speaker. She was already in recovery for multiple years and speaking at the age of 18. Like that's how early her drug journey started. And I mean, grant you might just be an exceptional person in general to be able to go out on a stage and do that at 18. You're talking to people that are the same age as you, for gosh sake. That's crazy in the most impressive way. But even if you're not going to be a speaker, that might be the exceptional part. I don't think it's exceptional to hear more of these stories of like kids trying drugs so young that they just get sick of it by 15, 16. And they're like, I don't want to live this way anymore. So, I mean, it's terrible in one sense that that's happening to people so young. But I think the communities exist if you really look for them. They are out there, and it might be so hard when you realize that your childhood best friend is now one of the biggest problems in your life. And that's what happened to our friend group. We were our own worst enemies. My best friend since 5 years old, he passed away 5 years ago, from a drug overdose. But we were best friends since 5. Him and I are all each other knew. We're hanging out 5 days a week since we're 10 years old, because that's when we really could start hanging out more often. And then one of us is doing drugs all the time. One of us wasn't. So now we're both doing it all the time. We had another childhood best friend since 3rd grade. He would have been that person that falls in that category of more experimentation for the most part. So he was able to stop doing these things eventually, no problem at all. This guy doesn't even drink anymore. He just has no interest in doing that stuff. But still, that's another friend that you've had since you were a little kid. And now they're doing this stuff all the time. So that can be devastating to realize that these friendships might not serve me right now. And you don't have to burn the bridge. You just might have to cross that one less often. And maybe that's the friend that you hang out with, in school, but not on the weekends at 10 p.m. on a Saturday, because that's a different version of that person. So my advice is just stand true in your principles and stay away from it, and realize once you are out of high school, there's just such a different life waiting for you. And then I guess if I can, very short piece is, if you're like, I'm never going to listen to this, what they now perceive, unfortunately, to be old guy telling me what to do with stuff, please don't drive. Like, if you're going to do stuff, please don't drive. I never once thought about, when I got behind a wheel on these drugs, that I could go hurt someone else. I thought I'm risking myself, and unfortunately, I didn't care about myself at the time, so it didn't matter to me. I never, for some reason, and I don't want to just blame this on lack of development of the teenage brain, but I swear on my life, I never thought about this. I never pictured the consequence of crashing into another car, where it's like, oh, maybe there's a mom and her kid in there. Maybe she's just sober, picking up her kids from school, or, dropping her kid off at wherever. And in no way, shape, or form does she deserve to have some drunk, high, whatever person crashing into them, at 6 p.m. on a weekday. That's not appropriate or okay in any sense. So if the reason I say don't drive is because that's probably the biggest one where we're now affecting other people and not just ourselves. I'm not recommending hurting yourself, but if you hurt another person and you were already messed up beforehand mentally, I mean, I can't even imagine how much worse off you would be. So there's again, my idealist advice, and then the realistic advice.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So what do you think helped you transform your life? Because you're sober now, correct? Yep. And have been for how many years?
Well, I want to, if I can disclaim something, I don't ever label myself I never say I can't drink again, but I've probably had 4 glasses of wine over the last 3 years. So I don't know if that's unconventional. I hope that's okay to say, because some people don't like that style. That is what has worked for me. I don't go do illegal stuff or stupid stuff, but Thank God I never even liked alcohol, so I don't have a temptation for it, but I'll drink like wine at a comedy club if my wife and I go. That's usually what it is. We go a couple times a year. So that's sober for me.
Okay.
Now, that's been for years, if we're counting that.
Yeah. So, I mean, your marijuana usage, that was the thing that really was your addiction. Obviously the Xanax too, but you said that you were able to go back to that when you had managed your anxiety. So it's been years since you've been sober from the marijuana. Okay. So what do you think helped you transform your life? Like, how did you get to where you are now?
It's the whole reason I speak. It's called the aha moment. And it sounds cheesy like a movie title, but it literally, there's no other way to describe it. It was 3.5 months in to probation. So I'm 18 years old, and it was New Year's Eve of that year. And my parents and probation officer were in a very tough position because I turned 18 like a week and a half after getting arrested. Thank God, because I would have went to actual jail doing what I was doing if I got arrested at 18. There's another piece of advice for teens, right? At 18, just because you feel like you're a kid, you're an adult. So there's adult consequences for stuff. So don't do stupid stuff. But they wanted to find a way to get me ready for the real world, which I was not really participating in. It was kind of a huge issue. It's like, now we're going to hinder him worse by he's not doing all the things that he should be doing. So as far as they knew, I was doing well. And that was not true. So they said, okay, you haven't done anything in months. I begged and pleaded to be able to go out on New Year's Eve. These people were not born yesterday. This was not as stupid as it sounds. The whole thing was, okay, well, it seems like you've been doing great. You haven't done anything in months. We don't have a problem with you going out on New Year's Eve, but this is probation, my friend. Like, this isn't how this works. So just because you're 18, this is not, again, go do whatever you want. If you want to do that, your parents have agreed. Only way it happens is if they drop you off at wherever you're going and they are picking you up at like 11:50, 12 a.m., whenever they're going home from where they're going, to verify that there's no drugs, nothing stupid, no alcohol, nothing on your breath, nothing like that. So of course I take that deal. That's the best deal I have. I made it 10 minutes into getting dropped off, and I'm drinking and doing drugs. We get picked up at 12 a.m. on the dot. And I said we, but I haven't mentioned we yet. We is myself and my high school girlfriend. So at that time, we had already been dating for like 4 or 5 years, believe it or not, on and off, very turbulent because of my stuff that I was doing. But, loved each other. First, like real loves. And I had convinced her to do a lot of the same things I did that night. Now, she had done stuff before, but never... she wasn't matching me, let's put it that way. So she gets into the car, and I have an ability to hide this stuff. So I'm not the main target right now. Like, I sound normal. My girlfriend did not. And we drove for not even a minute. And she, I mean, literally, word for word, repeats a full sentence to my parents. And when I say, like, what does that mean? People are always like, what do you mean repeated a full sentence? I mean, it's like, Bryce, you asked me a question like, hey, what did you do tonight? And she just said the same thing twice in a row. And I'm like, well, what? So I'm looking at her because the car's dark, right? It's like 12 a.m. I'm like, yo, shut up. I got this. Like, you stop. But she was normally very introverted, and she was not introverted that night. So that alone would have given it away without the double sentence thing. So my parents stopped the car in what basically the middle of the road. It's not even the full shoulder. My dad was driving, so he was the one that is particularly pissed. I mean, slams on the brakes. And him and my mom, no language spoken between them, they knew what was next, start screaming at the top of their lungs at my girlfriend. Now, I grew up with a sibling, and there was plenty of times that we got in trouble together. So I thought it was one of those things where it's like, all right, she gets it first, I get it next. They never yelled at me. And now looking back, I'm guessing this is probably a mix of one, they could not comprehend that I could be this stupid. And two, I do think there's an aspect of they don't want to believe it, right? Why would a parent want to believe that? But I wasn't exhibiting stuff as far as they knew. It really just looked like her. And so they're yelling at her. She does not rat me out. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't, say, well, look at what he did. And then we drive in silence for the rest of the 15 minutes home. We get home, and my choice that night was to start yelling at my girlfriend for getting caught rather than saying, thank you so much for not getting me in trouble. Because if my parents saw me get in trouble with this stuff one more time, this isn't grounding anymore. I'm 18. We're calling the probation officer and you deal with the consequences after that. My parents are not tough love people. They're pretty nice. This was just like, this is a million thing. There's no other answer other than to call the probation officer. So yeah, I should have been saying, thanks for not getting me put in actual adult jail. Like, I love you. You're awesome. Appreciate that. But I didn't do that. I blamed her. I said things that you don't say to anyone, let alone someone that you claim to love. And one of the last memories I have of this person is her bawling her eyes out for about an hour straight before we went to bed. I wake up in the morning and she had already left. That was not like her at all. It was very weird. But I started reflecting because I'm sober now. I'm like, okay, wow, that was awful. Like, we got to fix this one. And so I go to call her and I got through 10 different calls, maybe 11 or 9. I don't know. I always use the word 10, but it was 9 or 11, whatever. And I called her that many times and it just ring, 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 voicemail. Now, I just want to be clear because I don't want to be overly dramatic. She is alive. That's not what I'm saying. But why she wasn't answering is because that night was her final straw with me. There had been too much stuff over 4 years. It was one thing when we got into our stuff normally. It was a whole nother thing, I guess, to perceive that this person has now, brought me into this world of doing stupid stuff with him and then blames me for getting caught when I'm covering his, what, in front of his parents and potentially probation officer. So I knew that sober, that made sense, but that didn't make sense to me the night before. I don't know, Bryce, if that was the icing on the cake. I don't know if teenage love is just that powerful because I love this person to death. I thought I was going to marry them one day. I don't know. That thing hit me completely differently than anything else. Kicked out of school, house arrest, none of that stuff compared to this. It hurt so bad that it was like exactly what I needed. And in this moment of realization, sitting in my bed, because I knew she would answer me. I intuitively knew what this was. I'm like, she's not answering me. She's pissed. This is it. And I was right. I call them like the floodgates of self-awareness, like kind of opened up. And it was almost like everything I had been repressing for several years came flying in. It's like, dude, you are a drug addict on probation without a high school diploma in a place where like a fraction of these kids go to Ivy League schools, right? Like, I grew up nice as could be. And you're not, you don't even have a job. You have no job. You have no high school diploma. You're affecting your parents. You're affecting your friends. You're affecting the other family members. And now you've pushed away the last person that had your back through all of this. Anything I did always had my back. How much more do I need to lose before I start to accept that maybe the Evan Transue plan isn't working? That's what changed everything. All of that stuff hitting me so fast was, again, the only way to describe it is things I had been repressing for several years before that. It's like all at once, bam. And it sucked. It just hurt. I had never dealt with any real consequences, I guess. Like, you could say, I know getting kicked out and all that stuff was a real consequence of life, but I immediately coped with that with drugs. This is like the first thing that I'm like, wow, like, this is my person. This is someone I'm supposed to be with for the rest of my life, and they're gone. I could not wrap my head around that. There's probably still admittedly 1% of me that if I really just like sat and dwelled in it, I still can't comprehend that 10 years later, right? That is a terrible decision to make in a world that it's very hard to find someone that you connect with. Most of us at least have that problem. You know what I mean? Like, you're going around, like, you meet someone you like 50%, but not 100%. That changed everything. And my story, Bryce, just to be clear, we don't have to get into all this stuff unless you wanted to. It's very much a story of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So just like I admitted in the beginning, I am not saying I've never made a mistake again. I am not saying I've never used a drug again. But it was dramatically different. It's actually more probably fair to say like 10 steps forward, 1 step back, because 90% of my problems that I ever had before that, I dedicated to erasing after that. And I only made, it was like little hiccup mistakes. It was like things that I needed to learn. Like, oh, a major stress in my life happened. That's why I just went for drugs. I wasn't even connecting that stuff before.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how did I just, oh man, come on, Ev, how did I go for a year and a half not doing this stuff? It's like, dude, because you still never learned how to, you just forced yourself from pain. You still didn't learn how to cope with things in a healthy way. So I'm sorry for the probably longer-winded answer than was intended for that one, but that's just, I hate it, but it's also one of my favorite moments to share because it's just, I think it reminds me, maybe that's probably a good thing to be reminded of every now and then. But I needed that I needed that slap in the face to start making the right changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, change is hard. We don't want to do it, right? When we're in it, we think we've got it all figured out and this is okay. But sometimes the things that need to happen a lot of times,
Mhm.
excuse me, is just changing, right? Making a change, looking in to figure out why we're doing the things we're doing. Excuse me. What do you want parents to take away from this conversation? We downloaded a lot of things. Just as the final thought, what would you like parents to take away?
That we can always do better as human beings, but at the same time, it's not your fault or responsibility. Even I mean the word responsibility for every little stupid thing that your kid chooses to do. And the painful part of that reality means that, unfortunately, Bryce, if enough people listen to this, there's serious consequences that happen as a result of that, right? I am not proud to say this. I can't even tell you how many hours I've spent driving cars where I don't remember driving the car at all. That's luck that I didn't get in a crash. Like, just the fact that I didn't get in a crash at all, let alone that I didn't kill someone else or hurt myself. That's luck. So it's like I share these stories, and then, parents will sometimes glorify it. And I know that they're doing it because they love their kids and it's just for a shred of hope. They're like, oh, how did you do it? I'm like, man, I made some good decisions eventually, but yeah, it was about 3-4 years of getting lucky that I didn't die. That's what happened. And I don't know how to make sense of that. How does anyone make sense of that? Like, we want life to be fair. Life's not fair. Some people get lucky. Some people will do what I did one time behind a wheel and they'll pass away the first night that they do that. So I'm not saying this to upset anyone. I'm saying this because I think we do need more realistic answers in this space and not just the fluffy ones. Like, bad things happen sometimes. The only thing that we can do, I think, to make any sense of that bad is, before it happens, do everything that we can to become the best person possible, the most educated person possible. Go read books. I know this sounds silly, but especially for someone that doesn't have a college degree or doesn't even technically have a high school diploma, I read books all the time. That's the best habits I developed over the last 10 years, is reading. So you can go to Amazon right now. You could type in a category. I'm sure there's something of like, parenting for drug abuse. Go buy the top 10 books on that, man. Do Audible or Amazon. You probably spend less than $150 buying the top 10, maybe even less than that. And read. Become a better person so that you can at least say, if gosh forbid, I pray it doesn't, but if gosh forbid something bad did happen to your kid, you can at least say, I did everything that I could as a parent, because there seems to be nothing worse. I have never experienced this, obviously, but there seems to be nothing worse for parents than those that their kid goes to jail for a while, or their kid does pass away, and they live every day thinking that it's some moral failing, like we talked about in the beginning, on their part. It is always, I imagine, going to be the most tragic event in the world to experience this regardless. But I swear there are these parents out there that really did it all. And they've probably done the proper counseling and stuff, so they understand these concepts better. But you can tell they're like, no, I did try everything. And there's grief there. There's sadness. You can feel the weight of the tragedy, but there is an understanding that they did not cause this. And there is a huge difference between a tragedy that we think that we caused versus a tragedy that we at least acknowledge there was things outside of our control that occurred. So be the best person that you can in terms of the skills that you can develop, so that you say that you did it all, but also accept that this is a wild time. And if you're a parent listening, I would have to imagine, Bryce, that there's probably some parents that are listening because something bad's already happened. Okay.
Yeah.
My favorite quote, one of my favorite quotes, I should say, I'm a walking self-help book. I'm sorry. It's 10 years of reading. Is the final stage of healing is taking what happened to us to help others. Far be it from me to say that I know what's best for a parent, but I do know, for me, probably the only reason I'm alive still is because I have taken these experiences and used them to help other people. I wish I knew the dang channel name. I only see his YouTube shorts. I follow this guy on YouTube. His daughter passed away in a car accident that was just a quote unquote normal enough car accident. And she went over the guardrail because the guardrail was not like properly put in place. I'm probably butchering the story, unfortunately. But the bottom line is the guardrail was not put in place. The inspections weren't done properly. And this guy has it's a YouTube channel about guardrails, and it's huge. And he has dedicated his life to going out and inspecting these things himself, and has now, like, the city's getting attention to fund the stuff so that they can actually get fixed. Is that guy walking around happy all the time? I am sure he is not. Has that guy made the absolute best out of the worst possible thing that could have happened to him? Yes, and I sometimes think that's the only thing that will help us hold on as a human being. And it's impossible to say that he has not impacted people positively based on what he's done. So if you haven't dealt with the tragedy, do the best that you can and pray that that never happens. If it has already happened, there is no other answer in my mind other than taking this terrible experience and using it to serve others in some way, because that is going to give you some level of fulfillment, some level of understanding as to why what happened happened.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you, Bryce.
Thanks again, Evan. It was so brave of you to share your story with us, and we so appreciate all the information. If you like what we're doing, please rate and subscribe to our show. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and also keep the emails coming with topic suggestions for future episodes to accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a wonderful day.
Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.